Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this first session of Global Talks this term. Wonderful to see you. Hope you all had a good start into the new term, not feeling overwhelmed yet. A little bit of time. But yeah, I'm very excited that we could start off our Global Talks series this term by having Darlene here. You've encountered not only you're welcome, but every time you walk into the hallways, her presence is felt in a very nice way and enlightening way. So thank you already for curating the exhibition. It's such a inspiration to come in and read once in a while. Once one of those entries that you have there, and it shows you also the power of images and text and how you do this. So we're very fortunate to this, always. But let me start off before I introduce Darlene more fully. Let me start off on line that we acknowledge and respect the Kwang and Songhees and the Kwang people on whose territory the university stands, and the Kwang and the Sanish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. With this welcome and the acknowledgement of where we are and where we have the privilege to work and play here at UVic. Those of you who are not familiar with Darlene yet, let me introduce Dr. Clover more fully, who's not only a fellow here, but also a professor since 2004 at the Faculty of Education. And her research, and that doesn't come as a surprise if you look at, you have it here at the exhibition and the title for today, looking back to think forward, creating knowledge for a gender-just future. It is about using also museums and the capturing the knowledge, in particular innovative forms, to think about injustice, invisibility, gender injustices in various forms. And I very much look forward to hear how you and the way you use museums or artistic expressions to give voice to those who often don't have one. And that's what we see in the hallways in the exhibition already. So it's going to be a pleasure to welcome you again to the center and to the stage here, and invite you to give your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand because
You can go here or?
No, it should be able to read here. Okay. And also make sure I pay attention to the owl, apparently. Okay, and then try to run this sensibly. All right, there we go. So I'm going to talk today about my research, which is on museums and exhibitions, as comes as absolutely no surprise. The museum is one of the most brilliant, powerful genres of modern fiction, sharing with other forms of ideological practice a variety of methods for the production and factualization of knowledge and its socio-political consequences. As one of the premier epistemological technologies of the Enlightenment, the museum has been central to the social, ethical, and political formation of the citizenry of modernizing nation states. Okay, here we go. I'm going to say a little bit more about who I am, and I'm going to talk about the museum context in which I work, what feminist exhibitions do, and why and how they do it. So I think I also want to recognize the honor of living on these territories, but I, in addition, need to recognize the lands where I was born and lived and worked for so many years, what has formed me, which is the lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, in particular the Chippewa and Saugeen. One of the lessons, we had a project in 1994, which Bud will remember, that was funded by IDRC. And we were down in the Six Nations community. These are 6 of the Indigenous nations that have come together. And we were talking about Canada as a multicultural society. And one of the Indigenous elders put forward a position that he felt that Canada had to be a place that welcomed people who were experiencing violence and oppression and marginalization. And it had to be this welcoming space. And in the context of the violence of colonialism, that extraordinary generosity has stayed with me. And I have thought about my work in terms of how to be, of how generous we need to be in order to tackle this deeply troubled world, and it has never left me that teaching. I'm a feminist adult and professor, obviously, but that doesn't really count. Feminist adult educator and arts-based researcher, and I'm co-president of the Women of something, of a women's heritage site, until it imploded, in 2022. Sorry, I'll talk about it later. Okay, now I don't know what to do. Yeah, there we go. I'm also co-chair of the research group of the International Association of Women's Museums, which is headquartered in Merano in Italy. Okay. I'm a co-convener of the Feminist Imaginary Research Network, which is a global space of encounter, bringing together university scholars, researchers, museum curators, and scholars and educators, women's and gender museums. We organize gatherings in different ways. Physically, we're working now on a connection grant to go to Merano for their biennial. And we do special editions of academic journals, books, graphic reports. We're doing zines. We'll be doing pop-up exhibitions, 6 to 8 pop-up exhibitions, all of those kinds of things. I'm going to talk about, there's women, gender, and feminism in my talk. And so I'm using women as a strategic coalition, an umbrella under which we gather in order to make political demands. It is a non-homogeneous group, but it has been positioned as inferior. And inside that group, the oppressions and challenges are compounded by race, class, ability, sexuality, and all of those things. This is not a homogeneous group that all women are the same. They are not in any way the same, just as nothing is the same. This is complex, it's hard, it's difficult. If you want static definitions and wonderfully succinct definitions, look to the conservatives. They'll give it to you right there. This is a category that's ever exchanging and expanding. Gender looks at binary social constructions and the value judgments in those, because they are laden with value of what is important and what isn't. And what does the gift of feminism consist of, if not a certain bundle of ways of thinking historically, ways of seeing, ways of acting, knowing, can't read, can't see. So museums are my context. They preserve and conserve what they think is most important and worth showing and knowing. They are producers, shapers, and mobilizers of knowledge, whether they like it or not. Education is what they do. It is their central feature. They have a high degree of public trust. I've been reading a couple of different statistics where they're more trusted in terms of knowledge creation than universities. They use the scene, which is often our most powerful sense, not always, but the scene is a very, very powerful one. By that, seeing is believing. They are a place of ideas, and it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas. They have played a fundamental role in fabricating, maintaining, and disseminating many of the essentialist or historical fictions that have created the social realities and life for people, for women and other people who step outside the binary restrictions. They have played a huge role in all of this. If you think about the images that you see in these institutions, you'll see them on everything from baby formula, propaganda. It's all rife through popular culture. They have done a great service. They're the ventriloquists of the masculine divine. A lot of the time. There are other kinds of museums that try to do different things, but these large-scale mainstream museums, and I've been to so many around the world, and they continue to practice the same the narratives, the heteronormative masculine conquest, heroism, genius. These are the stories they tell. Yes, there are interruptions, and I'm going to come into that. But these are stories of passive, alluring femininities. They showcase how contorted and informed music videos, advertising, formula, album covers, fashion photography, pornography, you name it, They are there. If you walk through these institutions, you'll see them. They objectify, exclude, stereotype, misrepresent, disrepresent, and there are ramifications for reproducing and reinforcing superiorities and inferiorities and whitewashing centuries of oppression, control, and violence, and denying most of the population social and intellectual credibility. There are ramifications for this, and they are right in there dealing with this. Yeah. So creating this problem. Over and over and over again. So my study, I look in two different I look in two different contexts, and as I said, one is mainstream museums. I've had all kinds of different kinds of museums, but mainstream museums in particular. And one of the reasons is because these are the most visited, and if you are the most visited, you are going to be the most influential. You're going to be the one that people remember because they're the one. They also have enjoyed a long, relatively uninterrupted history of perpetuating gender and other forms of injustice. These are colonial, racist institutions as well, as you saw from the implosion of the Royal BC Museum. They're highly resistant and resilient to change. They are difficult company, but they're being forced to change. There's internal and external pressures against them, and that's what I'm interested also in looking at. So I also am then, of course, as I noted, is women's and gender museums. By their nature, they are activist, disruptive. They're for them, there is no such thing as neutrality. These ones are, pretending to be neutral. Their intention is to create new and difficult knowledge for change. And they're proliferating across the globe, although they have no money and no support. That's women's organizations. Yeah, they're just the same. There's no difference. So there's many ways that I look at museums, but one of the things that I'm really interested in is museums, is exhibitions. I visited thousands and thousands of museums, and it struck me one day that the educators were the exhibitions, all on their own, without any interventions. They had to educate. That was surprising to me, because when you think of educators, you think of people standing in front of a room or people there, but in fact, these were doing it on their own. And I'm also really, really interested in notions of storytelling, because museums are storytellers as well. To exhibit it means to choose, display, present, show, and tell. To choose is important because there are decisions made in terms of everything that's shown. Steeds calls them plays of force with high visual appeal, immersive capacity, and the ability to tell very compelling stories. A medium through which stories are created and become known in visual and narrative format. And stories are made up of distinct ideas, realities, stories, images within a common framework. And they're ideological. And they can maintain the status quo, and they can interrupt the status quo. So storytelling in these, of course, is text, the content of the display, the writing, which are the objectives, aims, labels, and then the reading, because you take something away from them. Not everybody will take away the same kinds of things, despite what museums try to tell you. You may not necessarily listen. However, they're very good at telling you what to think. So feminist exhibitions are something that I've turned my mind to. There have always been feminist exhibitions, but it was for the two countries and the rest of the world, there was a centenary in Canada, in particular in the UK, the centenary of the suffragettes, which was about 10 years ago, and it was in Canada. It was 2016. UK was 2018. And that set off a number of exhibitions about the suffragettes, but also beyond that, way beyond that, into taking up different kinds of issues. So it really was a galvanizing, and then the rest of the world started to pick them up as well. So they're happening in different parts of the world. There are tensions around these. They're always temporary. Feminist exhibitions are always temporary. They're permanent because they're meant to respond to something, but impermanence is the problem. There's tensions to assimilating women's stories into spaces and systems that are so deeply flawed. It's like, do you really want a piece of a toxic pie, or do you want to do something different? So as I said, they're also messy, they're non-chronological, there are multiple genres, they challenge patriarchal and institutional authority, they're interdisciplinary, there's surveys, but there's also themed, they coincide with women's movements, and they engage often explicitly or implicitly with feminists. Their elements, I'm going to look at, what I'm going to do is focus a little bit on their elements, not every single one of them, but the rehistoricizing, her-storying, animating, normalizing, retruthing, making present, naming, reconsidering, re-representing, rescripting, punching up, complicating, and gender bending. These are just some of the things that they do, and I can't concentrate on all of them, but I'm going to have a look at a few of them. So, to her, history matters because it helps us to understand the ideas, forces, choices, and circumstances that brought us to our current situation. And these feminist exhibitions tell women's stories. So they tell different stories. They tell stories of known women, but they also tell the stories of unknown women or relatively not known women. So they tend to really try to, what I call, flesh out the silhouettes. They tell stories from the point of view of women. They tell stories of marginalization and victimization, but they do not marginalize and victimize these women. So there's a recognition that this is on one hand, but there's also a real recognition of the power and contributions of women. And they take historical truths and they turn it on its head of what is common sense, and they retell it and re-visualize it. This was an exhibition that we did called Disobedient Women. And it was in response, I came back from, I think I was in England, I can't remember, I was somewhere, and there was about to be the sesquicentenary of Canada, that 150 years of celebration of Canada. And I won't sport with your intelligence long by talking about him, but Stephen Harper was on the radio, and he was asked what were the most important things about Canada. One, the War of 1812. We got the war. Two, hockey. Buttery on us. So we've got people with no teeth fighting with each other, guys. And it went, and a couple of other things, all of which excluded half the population of Canada, and was really, really about violence and conquest and defeat, and absolutely no narratives of anything that other people did. So this was an exhibition where we had contributions from women from across BC, and it was really extraordinary in terms of its fighting back, its counter narratives to the narrative of what Canada was and looked like, and also just challenging that whole idea of this nation state. Animation is a tool that they use, and they really do. If your histories have never been collected or preserved, how do you find them? It's a wonderful book called Dusting for Fingerprints, and that's what a lot of these exhibitions have to do. But they also use a great deal of animation and what they call creative nonfiction. This exhibition called Leading Ladies from Zambia looked at, it's an animation, it's a cartoon animation, which drew from oral stories of histories of women from down the ages to profile women who were warriors, diplomats, feminists, peace activists, and all of these different things, but all done in animation, because these women's lives, they're gone. Their stories remain, but the women are gone. And so there's no way of retracing that without creating it in some other way. This was also an extraordinary exhibition where this artist took famous paintings, but focused on the players in the paintings who have no voice and no story, because the story is about the main protagonists in it, and created a dialogue of what they felt in that time and what it would have been like to live then. And it was just unbelievably powerful hearing the voices pop up as the image of a nondescript person who's just backdrop to a painting spoke up. Making the absent present. This is a beautiful, beautiful installation, walking with our sisters, that captures, it's a series of moccasins, if you've never seen it, it's the banks, it's the top of the moccasins, which captures the names of all the women, of women who, the murdered and missing Indigenous women. And this is powerful because it is huge. This is the numbers of women who have been murdered and are missing, and it's absolutely huge. And it asks provocative questions, but it also names these women, which is really important. And naming is powerful. And it's another thing that these exhibitions do, because a lot of the time, the names are lost. But they're powerful because they show worth. It's about remembering, give meaning and communicative currency to things. This is why if you walk around, you will notice that all the monuments have men's names on them. Yeah. And all the sculptures, which are the feminine, are metaphors for things like peace and liberty and all of those kinds of things. They're not real women. And that's another struggle, is to get real women in those, but to name is power. They force us to reconsider. These were two extraordinary exhibitions at the Bata Museum. Yeah, who knew? The Bata Museum is one of the most progressive museums in Canada. It's extraordinary. So they did this wonderful exhibition called Whose Obsession? And it took that myth of women being obsessed with shoes, and it traced the ways in which this notion of obsession has been constructed and blamed on women. But one of the most amazing stories, and some of you may know this, I didn't, is the high heel is a masculine tool of war. Why? Because if you stand up on the stirrup, you've got your saber and you're going to try to kill somebody, and you stand in the stirrup with a flat shoe, you're going to slide. So they created high heels to grip the stirrup, so then when you gripped onto the stirrup, you can really kill somebody. So these shoes are extraordinary warriors. And this one took to task notions of, what is a doll? When is a doll not a doll? When it's an action man. This is not a doll. That's an action man. That's a doll. Yeah, so he gets to go swimming with the sharks, and she gets to teeter on the beach in high heels. So it really takes to task how we fashion masculinities and femininities. And it's just, and you're immersed in all of this, and it's funny. You want to scream into your purse. I mean, there's all sorts of things that it's making you do as it surrounds you. They normalize what is normal. So because they spend a lot of time around aging, and particularly women in aging, renormalizing. These are women that are activists, they're grannies, they're all sorts of things, but there are these multiple personalities and multiple things, and they have value. Who are the scientists and the activists? They give us role models, but without creating new elitisms. And that's the one thing that I really enjoy, is they're not setting up these heroes, because they tell the way in which they tell the stories. They individualize and tell stories, but they don't just create these new elitist heroes through these. And they make the everyday important. Most of us live in the everyday, but the everyday is not considered valuable enough to be preserved and conserved. So how do you revalorize the everyday and make that an important component of the history of the world? Power of language. It's the primary way social and cultural meaning that are produced and circulated is through language, through the words we use to describe the world, or not. So it's critical to interrogate language for both the blatant and subtle means by which it is an edifice of supremacy and how it's assembled. So how supremacy is assembled. So one of the ways, so I showed you the ways in which museums from that label neutralize. They sort of create This is about something else. It's rather than what it actually is. And one of the ways that they do it in museums, of course, is they have this, the God voice that explains a historical period without noting the differences that there might have been in that historical period. So this is how everybody experienced this historical period. This is what it is. This is the definition of the period. This is how we all experienced it, except for that most of the population didn't actually experience it like that. So in the Manchester Museum, they hired an artist who went around and she did what she called feminist revisions. So you've got this narrative, this very, very neutral sort of narrative that excludes so many and so much and says so little and yet says so much. And then underneath it, you've got the feminist revision. And what's really important is when I go there is that you have to bend down for the feminist revision. So they've kept the big normative one, and then you have to bend down. What she does, she takes exactly that story, but she just rewrites it. She just adds different kinds of pieces to it about how somebody else might see that, except that it wasn't everybody, was it? Because only men were able to do this, and she tackles all of these kinds of things. And if you were working class, there isn't a hope you'd ever be able to do this. And she tackles the whole thing. So she just absolutely rewrites it. So they left the historical piece there that for centuries, practically, explained what the world was and then takes it to task by just simply disrupting the same language. Representation is always a question of power. Always, who gets to be seen, heard, believed. Testimonial injustice is not believing people's words because they're not important. So representation is not simply the result of perception, learning, and reasoning. It is a process by which they produce particular and particularizing results. So what these feminist exhibitions do is say no to the way in which you're going to represent me, multiple representations and re-representations. Gender bending, it's not just about gender, it's a slippery thing that rubs up against other social signifiers. To examine genders to see how norms are constructed in the hierarchies and enable a richer analysis. So this was from a museum in Denmark, the Women's Museum in Denmark. They ran a series of workshops, creating works and finding works. And I think that this image right there this was just extraordinarily powerful. There was no label, there was no need to write anything about that. And then of course, there's always showing in, roses are red, gender is performative, mass market romance, heteronormative. Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. But this was created through these workshops. The whole exhibition was created through the workshops. Taking a stand. These museums do take a stand. They take a stand in favor of status quo. So what happens when you take a different stand? And this was the Haida Gwaii Museum, the museum in Haida Gwaii. Well, do you remember that lovely little idea of building a pipeline and then having all these super tankers come in to get themselves smashed like matchsticks up against the rocks and into Bella Bella or Bella Coola? Remember that lovely little plan? Yeah. And into Haida Gwaii. So who knew that they were all going to be coming past Haida Gwaii? So the Haida Gwaii Museum engaged artists and communities and everybody in creating counter images and counter stories to this. And this is what you're looking at here is this activist. It was a wonderful exhibition, an activist exhibition that took to task whose ideas and disentangled real life from the petrol-induced imaginary of the world. And then, of course, there's the People's History Museum. Does it just that. Punching up. The use of humor and satire is just rife across these exhibitions. The whole idea around, you know, when you often hear the narrative of, you know, women activists are just bitter and they hate everybody and all of these things, but it is so funny. You can't see this one, but from where you are, but it says the causes of lesbianism, and then the nurse is saying to the woman with her child, she says, it's a lesbian. So that's how you make lesbians easy. So challenging all these myths, but a way of resisting overwhelmingly disempowering narratives and visuals, a communal response of solidarity, to cope, as Carol Roy calls it, powering sense of rebelliousness, and the exposure of power in very different ways, the dynamics of power and turning it upside down and sideways. Hannah Arendt once argued that the greatest enemy of authority is contempt. The surest way to undermine it is laughter. So they're not perfect. They are working under extreme challenge. Not just the authority in these institutions, but just in general. So they don't do everything right. They don't have all the background of everything and everyone they would. None of them are perfect. But what they do is they flesh out the silhouettes of history. So they give it substance to the stories of women and the lives of women. They give visibility to those denied public audience and intellectual credibility. They show women as knowers and producers of knowledge, because what they know and how they have produced knowledge has either been excluded or undermined. They give voice and presence, the words, dreams, actions, aspirations, contributions. They enable self-representation women to show and see themselves in beauty, glory, absurdity, pain, wronged, intellectual capacity, and all of those. And liberating models of female self-determination in the face of normalized patriarchal narratives. They blast history open. They show its ruptures, silences, detours, and biases. How masculine supremacy has been mobilized and cemented over centuries, and the impact on the present. Women are neither silent nor idle, but there are what they call common differences, and it's very, these exhibitions make very clear that there are complicities and omissions and exclusions within feminist movements, within protest movements, within histories of how we capture women. And therefore there are commonalities, but without understanding differences of women, we'll never understand. We will never be able to have a different role if we don't understand this. And so they're very clear on differences. This is a really good example of that. So we have a very wealthy woman dressed in a dyed outfit, and her maid is helping her, and they both die because of the poisons in the clothing. So their lives are vastly different in terms of privilege, but they are both killed by being part of the fashion industry of the dyes that were leaking into their systems, whether they were just handling the clothes or whether they were wearing them. So there's a common difference that they play with of these different kinds of things to show. And then they do things the reverse, where it starts out the same, it doesn't end the same. Epistemic justice and agency. So what knowledge counts, as I said, reposition women as knowers. Epistemic agency is critically related to political agency insofar as particular action may require knowing. You may have to know something before you even know that there's a possibility. So you may have to make something visible and story something into the present in order to make it useful. Bring complexities into focus. Perceptual twist between opposites and the grounds that are not necessarily reconcilable. The world is full of opposites, and opposites can be problematic, but they're not always bad. And we have to just live and work in these complex opposites of victories and losses, of oppressions and solidarities. I mean, it's complex. So how do you illuminate contradictions and turn the world upside down so that people can see things differently from the way that they have? How do you visualize irrationalities and tackle rationality? And how do these women win? When if you are on the beach in your hijab, you're going to be arrested. And if you're not, you're going to be arrested. So what were you going to do? Well, then you don't go out. Creating a publicness. They pose difficult questions and provocative and unasked questions. But they're neither teaching individuals what they should be or know, nor demanding that they learn, but they're operating as an interruption. Why are there so many unidentified sitters? Good question. Extend and challenge the hegemony of common sense. Both proposes a common world and fits human beings into it. Common sense is common because people are made to believe it is true. It isn't necessarily true at all. There is a construction part of that. And so they encourage seeing beyond what we expect to see. Space to imagine and reimagine. To imagine is powerful because a different world can only become thinkable and imaginable once it is imaginable. Control over the imagination is control over the future. So, the most subversive thing a people can have is the imagination. So there are forms of public pedagogy, which of course is something that I'm really interested in. Well, I don't know how many of you ever saw this exhibition, but it was absolutely extraordinary. Procession of colonialism like you have never seen before in your life. So it's a gathering space. There are gathering spaces for discussion and reflection, theater where meaning and import are collectively seen and made, sighted embodied learning, the challenge ambivalences, renew encounters with diversity, visualize multiple ways of knowing, value representation on storied forms of knowing, creating memories. They're not simply isolated islands of existence, but a chain of interruption. Yes, sorry.
Just which exhibition was it? Because you mentioned that you see it, and so.
Yeah, what was the I'm trying to think of the title. I'm old. I can't remember anything ever. Yeah, I'll think of it.
Okay, later on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's amazing.
And it's available.
It's available online.
Online.
No.
It's a-
Because these do, in some ways, when you look at them, they look like just isolated islands, like little small projects that are happening. But when you start to see them around the world, you start to see this happening in different places, then that's why the draw from Foucault, they become chains of interruption. So they're linked and they're moving around. So I think that's. Yeah, that's it.
Makes me feel go straight to the museum now, and probably having a very different perspective on going through these whole.
I have ruined many a person.
Oh, yeah, you're sharp though, you. Who would like to start us off with a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Darlene, first, thank you for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. Just bouncing off something that you just said about these exhibitions connecting amongst each other. I'm wondering, because I'm assuming you've been researching this for very long, and I'm wondering if there has been a pattern of change throughout the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years, either more exhibitions, less, or a common theme, or yeah, how has it been throughout that?
Like all change, it's an ebb and flow. But as I was saying in the beginning, it really did, particularly in Europe and Canada, it really started to change with the anniversary of the suffragettes, because all of the museums scrambled They had exhibitions in foyers, staircases. They were trying to respond to this anniversary that they had 100 years to know was coming, but that's sorry, don't worry about that, just because they didn't catch on till an hour before. And so they really scrambled to try to do it, but from that, I've witnessed a lot of it, like an explosion. And in different parts of the world as well. You pay a heavy price sometimes though, so there's countries where it's easier to do this and countries where it's harder. So for example, it's a lot easier to do it in Costa Rica than it is in Iran. So one of the curators in Iran, in the Iranian Women's Museum, curated an exhibition. Evin prison is the notorious prison for women prisoners, women political prisoners. It's all women, but there's volumes of women political prisoners in it. And inside the prison, they had created a number of crafts, artisan crafts. So teddy bears, blankets, different kinds of things like that, not political in that sense, not protest art, just artisans. So she curated an exhibition of these crafts, and he was thrown in Evin prison. So they came to the museum, they shut the museum down, she was thrown in Evin prison, and she's now in exile. So there's a price to be paid for this as well, depending on where you are, and the discussions which are, kinds of discussions which we're going to be having in Merano is around definitions of women and what museums do, what women's museums do, because you can be arrested for choking your friends and and lesbian, gay issues, like in some countries. So where it's not acceptable, you're not allowed to not be a man or a woman, and you have to explain which one you are, and you have to stay within that boundary and behave yourself. And so you could be arrested for that. So it's the ebb and flow of it. India is really moving forward because of all the kinds of things that have been going on in India. So India's got lots of different kinds of feminist exhibitions coming up. And so how they do it, how carefully do you do it? How out front can you be and how careful do you have to be depends upon the political circumstances. In India, they tend to do it, doing it more just by showcasing women's art, women artists, women's art. Because you don't want to, if you start trying to tackle too much, you can end up, as Rajesh, our colleague Rajesh knows, you have to sort of work in that. Well, so how do you push back? And how do you interrupt? To not get thrown in jail or have your museum shut down altogether and silenced. So where is the line in all of this? And a lot of them walk out. And those are some of the difficult but important conversations that we have. Yeah, I met you then.
No, I go.
You're in.
Maybe I have to drop.
Okay. He's in charge.
Yeah.
I'll answer. And you want me in charge and you answer.
I'm happy to put you in charge, but for now, it's given many.
So I can be quick. It's just like appreciating the approach of art space and how the power of narratives are so important. And in my mind, I was thinking how useful this is for other equity seeking groups. Like it's the same story maybe with Black people or with immigrants or queer people, where the story is not being told, or it's just this like tendency for heteronormativity and a dominant paradigm that is taking over all the narratives. And so art is really powerful, and just like how museums can play a role, but I can understand also this almost like cultural diplomacy that plays also an important aspect. So I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate your presentation today. Thank you.
That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Fascinating topic that's actually, I think we're talking here about the patriarchal structures, right, around the world and not just in museums, it's everywhere
Yes.
in a certain way.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you did your research, were you ever able to find an exhibition that targets, more like in directions of bell hooks, feminist, that says patriarchal structures are also very imposing on men's and on their masculinity? Because it would be interesting to see if there are any narratives that bring this together. We kind of try to interrupt a narrative, as you say, but I was wondering if we bring also in other exhibitions the perspective of men's inside too, because it's together, like we all work together. It's not just the one side. Question mark.
Yeah. So one of, let me give you an example. We went to see an exhibition called Fashioning Masculinity, which was a disruption to masculinities and, well, or just stories around that. So I had just come from an exhibition called Fashioning Femininities. And there was a huge difference between the feelings of power in the two exhibitions. There were no stories of the women were completely shut down. They were being fashioned. There were no real stories of power. In the fashioning masculinities, there was a lot about gay men, trans men, and their challenge to masculinities, and there was a real power in that exhibition. So what I'm trying to explain is there are differences in power. And so by looking at those two exhibitions, even though they were trying to challenge the normative notions of masculinity as this power dynamic, but the exhibition was empowering to men, whereas the exhibition about women was not empowering to women because there wasn't any narratives of empowerment in them. And so it's difficult to try to do that. But fashioning masculinities was a way of trying to show different stories, but the power dynamics were so fundamentally different from the one that I had come to, and who can be in control and who can speak, and who can take charge and who can be public was totally different. And I'm not saying that there wasn't oppression and marginalization in there as well, but there was a power dynamic which was powerful. Powerful. So that's.
Because you got to Jeff and then Kelly and then.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We're at Royal Roads University, we're actually engaging in a project called Reimagining Habitat.
Oh.
So exhibits, museums, discussion are fully underway, and there's an external consultation and an internal one, and so it's really exciting to find. And I was really intrigued with your Manchester University experience where you had the feminist revision. And as you were mentioning, these other topics of inclusivity where we could have other perspectives and interpretation. And I'm just wondering, from that sense of advising museums, and certainly we'll approach you to get you involved with this project, and anyone else interested, would you see more value with that kind of different boards offering different interpretation of something, rather than one kind of fusion of interpretation?
There's value to both. So if you leave history, you can only combat history and the way in which history shapes the present if you recognize that it was there. So by completely wiping it out and pretending it wasn't there and just creating a new narrative, it's important to learn from history. So that's why they decided, rather than just redoing all of so you could just redo every single one of those. Wouldn't have to be smart aleck about it, or like the feminist revisions is a smart aleck, right? Takes it on, disrupts it, does everything. Wouldn't have to do that. You could just rewrite it to say that it was men. At this time, all the artworks in this exhibition are by men. They are not by women because women have been excluded. That's an important way to do it, is to create a narrative like that that shows that. But this is another way of doing it, which is to disrupt that. And I think it's important to do both. So to create, because if you create a new history of, of Indigenous oppression is not just a new history of Indigenous peoples, it's a new history. It's a new history, so you want to create that new history. But you also want to recognize in some ways. So there's different methods of doing it. And I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. It would depend on what it was, the objective of what it is you're trying to do, what's necessary. And they wanted to show the authority, they wanted to show this, they wanted to disrupt the authority of the museum to tell the story. So that's what they were trying to do. So what is the objective of what it is that you are doing? And what is the objective of each room? What is the objective of each part? So that's what you need to, as always, what is the purpose? And if the purpose is one particular thing, then what is the best way to do that? So there's both of creating those new visions and new narratives, which simply start with a new vision. And then there's also the recognizing, like at Howdy Castle. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. I would disrupt it. It's also more fun when you get in there and all of a sudden somebody's doing something really, like, you're what? Are you serious? I didn't think about, and you start looking at it when somebody says something, when there's a provocative question. So there's a statement, stays the same, then that's what they'll often do as well, is a very provocative question. That makes you think, so that's not actually the way it was. That's not the whole story. There's a different story, because if that was the story, they wouldn't be asking me to think about something else. And it's just a different, what's the pedagogical role of the intervention?
Let's go online. Kelly, would you like to raise your question by unmuting yourself, or should we read it because you put it? Kelly, you know you're up there, so please.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll try and speak it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
This is kind of just a new-ish awareness that I have, that I learned, that dictionary definitions are based on the most common understanding, widely held understanding in probably mainstream society. They're not necessarily the most accurate, or there's not a lot of diversity. In fact, over time, old definitions that may be more accurate than current common understanding are archived or deleted. So I just started getting this kind of impression of dictionaries as kind of like a type of museum of words, and just really got kind of energized about the thoughts of this kind of analysis and work being focused on dictionaries. I just wondered if you happen to know of anything of that nature aimed at dictionaries.
I haven't seen anyone do anything like that, but I like that idea as a museum of words, although dictionaries are, I mean, they'll have the word of the year, and they do attempt, like museums, to be neutral and to just show the usage as well. So that's another thing that they try to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are about that. So I think it's a wonderful a project. I'd be interested in that one.
Yeah, I think, and maybe I'll just be more specific. Dictionaries that are highly regarded, like say Oxford, certain dictionaries have a very firm protocol about adjustments. And then of course there's more innovative kinds of dictionaries and lots of dictionaries, but like looking at kind of mainstream museums that kind of really where there's a lot of participation, and I think, as you said, they have a lot of influence. Looking at mainstream, well-regarded, very entrenched dictionaries that have a lot of influence and maybe our reference point for definitions when we're not sure, but we keep on going back and reminding ourselves or reifying definitions of a certain time, of a certain place, a certain worldview, maybe a certain gender bias, a certain certainty, right? When in the world of uncertainty. So it's a really interesting phenomenon to me to kind of think about what you've done. So thank you so much for igniting a connection for me.
You're welcome. Thank you. I love it.
Thanks, thanks, Darlene, for the presentation. I was curious in like reflecting on the exhibits that you've been looking at. Like you mentioned how a lot of them are interrupting kind of ruptures and silences with respect to women and gender.
Yeah.
And I was kind of curious if you found that many of them were doing that within their exhibits as well. Like, were they incorporating that? Were they kind of like being self-reflexive or self-interrupting in their exhibits? And if you did notice that, if you noticed if it was tied to any particular types of maybe institutions where those exhibits are, or yeah, there's kind of like general curiosity.
Yeah, they can be very critically self-reflexive. I noticed that in a lot of the exhibitions, and that notion of common differences. There are often interruptions to their own narratives about what they, the difficulty of finding stories, or what stories they hadn't considered in the beginning until they had come across something like that. So they will have different things that show the construction as well, which you never see. The curator is God, they curated it, that's the story. Full stop. But a lot of them will interrupt their own narrative to challenge, and that's one of the features of feminist exhibitions, is to take itself to task in terms of what it might not. So therefore, there'll be a story about how a different room came into being, or a different series of images came into being because of something that would not have been told before, would have not been thought. Necessarily in the conception of it, but how it came in. So you often get something like that as well, and I'm starting to look at that a little bit more closely, of how they actually do that, how they challenge their own assumptions. That's what they're doing, right? That's what they're doing. So, and then also what their own limitations, which we needed to have more images about Indigenous women's struggles during the suffragette movement times, but we don't have it. And ignoring these was being complicit with the status quo and with the patriarchal order of things. By ignoring these stories, we're also complicit, things like that. And the women's movement was the women's movement. Although one of the things that was really interesting in the story, one of the stories is that the suffragettes themselves, do you know the restrictions that everybody said, well, yeah, but they didn't fight for everybody, and then there were all these restrictions. They didn't make those restrictions. Suffragettes had nothing to do with who was identified by the males in Parliament who would get the vote. They did not. They didn't design that, they didn't do it, they didn't want it, they didn't agree with it necessarily, but they get the blame for it. So the women blaming as well, historically, like who really decided that? Who was behind the full decision of that? That doesn't in any way take away the responsibility of those women, but those responsibilities those women should have had to include more women and more voices. That does not in any way accept that they didn't do that, but it does also turn it around to say that there are forces here that are obstacles, and we need to continue to look back at what is the root cause and what is the biggest force here, because that force is the one that has separated women. And that means, and when you separate and fight, then the emancipation of all is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But there's a lot of forces against coming together, including women, which they never step away from. They never pretend that's not there. They're really, really good at that. A couple of the exhibitions did bother to do that, and I didn't bother focusing on that. So just another, Mary stories of normative women, right? So that's not a feminist exhibition. That's a women's exhibition. They're not.
I was just from then, myself.
So one of the points of discussion is around essentially the design of exhibits, and often we're dealing with like the co-construction of meaning with the audience. And one of the worries I have is that if we if we're trying to reach audiences that don't normally get exposed to these ideas, what are the things that we need to take into account?
Make them fun and interesting.
Yeah, I
Make
thought
them,
humor was a good one too.
humor
Yeah.
is important.
Yeah.
Make it about them. Show how the stories matter to them. Make it relevant. This is what these exhibitions do. Museums are always whinging on and on that they only attract a specific level of audience, and it's very, very true. I go to thousands of exhibitions. I can assure you that this is a monocultural audience for the most part, not in these spaces. And these are messy. I mean, these are out of control. They're loud, there's somebody yelling, there's all kinds of weird stuff. You're not allowed to speak in museums because it's this silent reverence, and these ones are yelling and using video that are causing nothing but disruption, and you got some messy woman saying it or something. But what it happens is even though these are stories of the past, they are relevant to me in the future. They're relevant to me in the present. And they enable thoughts about the future. So making that relevant. What does Hatley Castle? It's in a history, it has its particular history, but so what? What is the relevance to the community? What is the relevance to people? What are the stories of the people that were around there? Because Hatley Castle didn't just suddenly appear in the middle of nothing. It appeared in the middle of Indigenous territories, in people that lived in the area. So make it relevant, make it funny, make it engaging, use lots of visuals, and make it relevant. That's the main thing. And a lot of exhibitions as well, most of these exhibitions all end with a way in which people can engage with the exhibition. So what I've done for the exhibition that's in there is there's cards, and you can actually write down something, and then the reason it's right at the exhibition is so that your story is there, whatever it is you share. They do QR codes, they ask questions, they do all sorts of things, but in a way that allows people to have some input into it. And that input isn't in the back room. That input is put right into the exhibition in some way, so that it becomes even more relevant, because you see Jill's story or Mohammed's story or whatever it happens to be, you see these stuff. So there's a way of making sure that people can interact with it. Some people won't.
Hello.
Darlene, my name is Azra. Thank you so much for the presentation. Apart from your research, of course, it's interesting, and of course, but the main point is that you gave us a few concepts. I mean, very powerful concepts that I think, for me personally, that those just put me into thinking. So when you talked about imagination, I was so much absorbed in that I lost focus of the new concept. You were talking about it, you were talking about feminism, and then you said that, but women are different.
Right.
So I lost the track of your point at that point, and I'm wondering if you don't mind to explain that when you were talking about feminism and women are different. And why I am asking this question, because of my background. Feminism, the idea is in its like foundational state in Pakistan, or especially from my Pashtun background. So like we can't say, we will be talking about these things, but you can't use the terminology. And second thing, regarding your stories, when you were collecting all those stories that I could see in that hallway, there are different stories. So yes, I can understand different women, different stories. How do you see all those from a feminist perspective?
For me, that's what for me, it's about changing the world by taking difference along with us. But the only way we're going to change the world is if we accept, understand, and work with difference. Because there are commonalities, but there are also differences. And it's the differences that are the most unique and interesting. Why does nature waste its time being so diverse? Why doesn't it just have a couple of things? It'd be a lot easier to run.
Yes.
Right? But it doesn't. And so that uniqueness, that difference, it's difficult. It's very difficult, because it would be nice if we could just say, okay, we're all the same, we all feel the same, and it's all gonna happen the same. Because then it would be a lot easier to shift the world, might be a bigger force. but it's not like that. And so the ways in which oppressions and, everybody, this is a patriarchal world. And it hasn't gone away, and it has the resources with which to fight back. All of them, actually. So, so inside that, because of that, women are because of the differences, because of racism, patriarchal racism, because of colonialism, there's all kinds of ways in which women are oppressed and treated differently because of multiple different kinds of things. I'm becoming old. So now I can walk up to a counter and there's people getting served and they actually don't even see me. I'm thinking about robbing a bank. Nobody's, then, did anybody see anything? No, didn't see anybody, right? So I'm just gonna get away with a whole lot of money. So that's how it works out when you, identities can also change and things also shift and change as well. So it's not just that you were born one way and then because it's, so it compounds all of these different kinds of things. And yeah, there's certain things you just don't want to say. You just can't say.
Oh, thank you.
Do you mind waiting with your bank experiment until after your fellowship? I had a question, because, I'm looking at museums at the moment, they're under considerable pressure, right? On the one hand, you're right, they preserve all the heritage, they're such important things. But if you look around the world, they're under financial distress, there's decreasing trust and interest in them, except, the particular group of people. And there are multiple challenges. The feminist, perspective is one of them. The other one is, dealing with colonization. And when I was in Hamburg, the museums shut down, right? And just need to reinvent themselves because what we've done over a century, we can't do anymore. I'm just wondering, the amount of challenges that museums face and their willingness to engage with these things. Do you see, that if you look at museums, but probably their organizations, are they open to these kind of issues? Because it's a fundamental critique of how they've done things. And I'm just wondering, what is the willingness to even, consider this as a radical way of considering how to do these things?
Ebb and flow, depending on their power. They're like universities.
Right.
They have the power with which to fight back. And they have a stability, and when you destabilize that, nobody likes that. They're very, very good at keeping stable.
Right.
They have an incredible balance, and steady as she goes. So it depends on the leadership. It depends on the amount of money coming into an institution or where the money's coming from. It depends on the historical trajectory. As I say, there's lots of other kinds of museums popping up, the people's history museums and things like that. And they are still really, really being visited. They're employing different kinds of digital technology. But one of the things I really love about these exhibitions is they rely much more on the tactile. They are not just high tech. They're still very much tactile. You can feel, see. But yeah, they have inflow. I mean, so, and then they'll retreat. So how do you retreat into something? So you retreat into fossils, for example, because fossils. No, you get mad at a dinosaur fossil. So the best thing to do is to retreat, as I've noticed this happening, and I won't mention the museum, into dinosaur fossils. Put up your big dinosaur. Just try to stay calm and weather it out, is also something else. When push really comes to shove, then they really goes down. So yeah, it depends. Tate Britain is steady as she goes for most of it, but then they have these very disruptive temporary exhibitions. Should those temporary exhibitions are important because they are exciting and then you get people to come and they do things like that. But should there be more permanence to a lot of the narratives that are going on in the temporary exhibitions? They have their money and they have their particular collections, and the curators are some of them. Okay, I know, Emilia.
Oh, okay, sorry, I didn't see you, you know.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I actually have two questions. One is the smaller one. Do you remember the slide about the Canada's anniversary when they mentioned hockey, the First World War,
Yeah.
like the Canadian, I mean,
The imaginary of Canada.
what are other symbols they used at the museum you mentioned? Just curious for me.
Well, this is the narrative that I came back. When we created the disobedient women's exhibition, that was the narrative that I came back to. That was an official narrative coming from the Prime Minister of the then Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah.
Who was asked by a CBC reporter, what he thought were the most critical things to be remembered about Canada. So that's what he was, that's the particular narrative of that. But in relation to museums, nothing screams colonialism like when you used to go in, so they've shut it down now, but if you went into the Royal British Columbia Museum, you had these iron gates, and coming through the iron gate was a ship, a colonial ship. And it said becoming BC. So whatever was behind you, which was the Indigenous exhibitions, that wasn't BC. That was irrelevant. That wasn't anything important. That was back there. This was what we were going to be and become. So it created a whole narrative of modernization and what's important and the future, simply by placing that ship the way that it did.
Actually, the other question was about the museums, but I work with this topic myself, but it's not my major topic. I just finished my paper about the museum employees, because when we talk about like this presentation you gave today, you were talking about the museums, the institutions.
Right.
However, they are made of people, of alive human beings with their own narratives, with their own feelings, perspectives, etc., etc., etc. And I was wondering if you are familiar with any kind of research about these people who work in this field, because like not an institution like the museum, it's very abstract to me. I know some, but not enough to.
There's a lot of studies of the curators and of people of we did a study of the educators. So we did a 2-year study of the educators, the women and men who work in these institutions, who do the education, play the educational role, who design the educational programs and all of that. And we started out with that these would all be women and men, and all of a sudden we realized that they were 99% women.
Yeah.
And then we thought about it, the curators were at that time almost all men. So that's.
When was it?
That was back, the first grant was in 2010.
Really?
I think we got the money, yeah. And the curators were almost all men, and we were looking at the UK and Canada only. So, and then there's also the notions of class and privilege and all of that that's going on in there, but the lowest people, and the lowest considered people were the educators in these institutions. And then the differences, we also were looking at the ways that they talked about the leadership, how the leadership changed or didn't, the directions of the institution and all of those kinds of things. So there are a lot of studies that look at particularly, and the power of the curators. Because I went to a horrible presentation in Bristol once about leading from the middle, which was the curators taking over. It's actually terrifying.
One last question.
That was my question.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to know about leadership in the museums and like curation and and just because that seems where the place of interruption could also be is changing who's
in charge. And that person, if they step out of line, can also. And
And just maybe to understand a little bit deeper, so financially, the museums are basically public, all of them that you have been.
Yeah, the women's and gender museums aren't funded by anything, but yeah.
And means then, depending on which parties
That's right.
govern and which interest allow certain narratives to come up or not, right?
And what's going on at the time, so one of the unfortunate things for the RBCM is that there was if an institution is publicly funded, it is line itemed in the budget. And the RBCM was line itemed for a revamp. There was a lot of money in the budget to fix this institution that was aging in so many ways. Needed narratives, needed interventions. It came up at the time of COVID. It was announced that there was going to be a whole lot of money, which was budgeted for that institution. And the public went ballistic, saying, why don't we put it into homelessness and all of that other stuff? Never line items for that, it's never gonna go there, that wasn't how it's gonna happen, and it exploded. And that was part of the exploding as well, so.
In Canada.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, here, right here in
BC. Victoria.
Thank you, Darlene, for such a stimulating talk, you know.